Havenwood was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, where crime was something you read about happening somewhere else. But in the summer of 2008, that illusion shattered when a single night of violence proved that no town, no matter how peaceful, is ever truly safe. On a Tuesday afternoon, 8-year-old Sarah Jenkins vanished. Her last location was her own backyard. The yard was bordered by a low, chain-link fence, the kind meant to keep dogs in and casual wildlife out, but which offered no true barrier to the outside world. Sarah had been playing with a bright red kickball, a cheap, cheerful plastic orb that would later be found resting innocently beneath a hydrangea bush, a silent, mocking witness. The first officer on the scene was David Shaw. In 2008, Shaw was 27, 3 years out of the academy, fueled by caffeine and the certainty that he could categorize any situation. He wore the blue uniform of the Havenwood Police Department with a fresh, crisp pride that had not yet been softened by cynicism. When he saw the frantic, tear-streaked faces of the Jenkins parents, his initial reaction was procedural, not panic. The details seemed too mundane, too common. A minor disagreement over playtime, a brief distraction, and suddenly the child was gone. Shaw noted the lack of forced entry, the absence of any suspicious vehicle reports, and the acrimonious, ongoing custody battle between Sarah's mother and her distant biological father, who lived 3 states away. He mentally checked the boxes: domestic complication, runaway/disoriented juvenile, not a stranger abduction. He sat in the living room, a floral scent clinging to the air, and typed his initial summary into the bulky laptop. Subject: Sarah Jenkins, female, age 8, approximate height 48 inches. Last seen wearing pink shorts and a yellow t-shirt. Missing time estimated at 90 minutes. High probability of parental involvement or willful departure from residential zone. Proceed with standard area canvass. That word, dismissal, was not written, but it permeated his report. He spent 3 hours walking the perimeter, interviewing the 2 closest neighbors, one of whom was deaf and the other legally blind, and assuring the Jenkins that, statistically, children who go missing from suburban homes are almost always found quickly. He recommended extending the canvass only to the next block and advised the parents to try calling the paternal grandmother. Shaw viewed the case as an administrative nuisance, a dramatic but ultimately soluble domestic flare-up. He finished his shift that night, mentally clearing the file, ready for the next call, a genuine crime, perhaps like the recent string of petty mailbox vandalism. He closed the file at 11:45 p.m. By sunrise, Sarah Jenkins was a missing poster, and David Shaw's career and his conscience were forever warped by the certainty of his error. He would never forget the simple arrogance of his initial assessment. The assumption that Sarah Jenkins would turn up within 48 hours collapsed into a gaping hole of permanent absence. Within a week, the FBI had opened a field office in Havenwood's community center. Within a month, the search dogs were gone, and the local news crews had packed up, leaving behind a silence heavier than any noise. The missing persons case of Sarah Jenkins, HBDC file 2008-0041, didn't just go cold. It froze the soul of the community, and specifically the soul of Officer David Shaw. The case became a phantom limb. It wasn't officially his as Detective Hayes took over, but Shaw had been the original assessment, the one who categorized the initial probability, the one who had argued against immediate Amber Alert issuance. He had argued that alerting the entire state for what was likely a miscommunication would erode public trust for true emergencies. His prudence was now his internal prosecutor. He tried to escape it. He threw himself into patrol, dealing with DUIs and noisy disputes, seeking the clean, quantifiable ugliness of verifiable misdemeanors. But every night, when he returned to his small apartment, the image of Sarah's missing poster, her gap-toothed, 8-year-old smile, stared at him from the corkboard where he pinned his grocery list. The years did not pass. They accumulated. Shaw earned his stripes, moving from patrol to plain clothes, eventually becoming Detective Shaw, a man known for his meticulous detail work and his grim, unshakable reserve. His face, once fresh with ambition, became a map of tension, deep lines around eyes that perpetually scanned for things that weren't there. He traded his crisp uniform for sensible, if slightly worn, sport coats and chinos. He avoided the floral aisle in the grocery store. That scent, forever linked to the Jenkins living room, triggered a physical nausea. The case affected his personal life, casting a shadow over potential relationships. How could he explain the invisible ghost that sat between him and any woman? The ghost of an 8-year-old girl he was supposed to have saved? He had learned to trust the anomalies, the tiny imperfections in a scene, the smudge that shouldn't be there, the lock that should have been broken. This hypervigilance, born of Sarah's disappearance, made normal life impossible. He would inspect every woman's car for hidden compartments, every casual acquaintance for hidden motives. By 2023, 15 years later, Detective David Shaw was 42. He was unmarried, childless, and a walking embodiment of professional trauma. He was respected, known for closing cold cases, ironically, but secretly viewed as rigid and emotionally remote. He was the quiet sentinel of Havenwood, a man whose entire career was built on proving wrong the initial, damning mistake he made on a warm Tuesday afternoon a lifetime ago. The weight of HBDC file 2008-0041 was not the weight of one case, but the cumulative weight of every possible life Sarah Jenkins might have lived. Detective Shaw's routine had become a fortress against chaos. Every Friday at 3 p.m., a time slot religiously protected from meetings and appointments, he performed the ritual of the archive. He would descend into the basement of the Havenwood Precinct, a stale, concrete space smelling faintly of mildew and forgotten paperwork. The archives were a literal cemetery of the town's unsolved troubles. He would pull the specific file from the metal shelf, HBDC 2008-0041. The file was thin, almost insultingly so, reflecting the scant information gathered in the first critical hours. He never reopened the case itself. That would require a new, verified lead, which had never materialized. Instead, the ritual was a silent act of penance, a re-examination of the original, flawed data. He would pull out the core documents, the initial police report, his own, stained with the coffee he'd spilled on it years ago, the single grainy school photo of Sarah with the gap-toothed smile, and the inventory of her belongings. The item that always snagged his attention was listed simply as one red rubber boot, missing mate. Sarah had been wearing a pair of bright red, oversized rubber rain boots that day, despite the clear weather. Her mother had found only one, neatly placed beside the back door. The other boot was never recovered. The experts dismissed it as irrelevant, suggesting the child simply walked out of it. But for Shaw, that missing boot was the entire narrative, proof that the trajectory was interrupted, that the movement was neither willful nor simple. He would sit there for an hour, the cold air seeping into his bones, rereading the neighbor's useless quotes, studying the aerial photograph of the Jenkins yard, looking for the tiny patch of disturbed earth he had missed. The ritual was not about finding a clue. It was about ensuring he never forgot the arrogance of his initial dismissal, forcing himself to confront the ghost in the machine of his memory. He needed to be haunted to be effective. In the ensuing 15 years, he had closed 7 major cold cases, using the lessons learned from his failure with Sarah. Assume nothing, trust no one, and analyze the data for anomalies. He found a killer in Cedar Creek by noticing the inconsistent timestamps on a victim's email draft, and he caught a fraudster by comparing the shadow length in 2 supposedly separate photographs. He became a man whose entire professional identity was a negative image of his greatest mistake. He was efficient, but joyless. He was successful, but damned. And every Friday, he would return the thin, beige file to the cold shelf, promising the ghost of Sarah Jenkins that he hadn't truly given up, even though the leads had died a decade ago. The case was formally inactive, but in Shaw's mind, it was the only file that truly mattered. It was an ordinary Tuesday in September 2023, the kind of day that felt less like a police procedural and more like an accounting audit. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the cramped bullpen of the Havenwood Detective Division. Detective Shaw was seated at his desk, which was a marvel of organized chaos, stacks of binders perfectly aligned, yet dusted with the fine grit of accumulated time. He was wrestling with the administrative nightmare of an interstate car theft ring that had targeted expensive, late-model SUVs in a nearby county. The paperwork was tedious, requiring him to cross-reference VINs and insurance claims. A mind-numbing exercise in logistics, far removed from the high-stakes drama that movies promised. He wore his standard professional uniform, a charcoal sport coat, slightly too tight across the shoulders now, and a perpetually worried frown. His partner, Detective Gina Rodriguez, a sharp woman half his age with an unsettlingly sunny disposition, was on the phone across the room, loudly coordinating a neighborhood outreach program. The noise and the relentless mundanity were Shaw's armor. It confirmed that the world, despite the hidden evil he knew existed, still spun on the axis of routine. He paused his work, rubbing the bridge of his nose where a stress headache was starting to bloom. 15 years. The anniversary of Sarah's disappearance had passed quietly 3 months prior, marked only by a brief, respectful mention in the local paper that ran the old, grainy photo one last time. He had sent the Jenkins a sympathy card, a duty he had performed every year, feeling the inadequacy of the gesture like a physical blow. He had tried to call them last month, but the line was disconnected. They had finally left Havenwood, selling their house and taking their grief and the ghost of Sarah with them. Shaw found himself staring at the digital clock on his monitor, 3:07 p.m. Exactly the time the Jenkins family had realized Sarah was truly missing. He felt the familiar, low-grade thrum of failure in his stomach. He shook his head slightly, reached for his lukewarm coffee, and focused on the next VIN number. Focus on the quantifiable, he told himself. The past is a phantom. The paperwork is real. He was determined to close this car theft case by Friday, a small, tangible victory he could hold against the crushing weight of his ultimate professional defeat. He listened to the predictable drone of the police scanner, the muffled shouts from the front desk, and the click of his keyboard. Everything was ordinary, predictable, and resolutely safe. He felt a sense of heavy, dull control, the quiet hum of a perfectly organized machine running on empty. He sighed, prepared to spend the next hour cross-referencing registration documents. He could not have been more wrong about the safety of that routine. The sound was subtle, initially masked by the distant, tinny squawk of the police scanner reporting a lost cat on Maple Street. It was the sound of the precinct lobby door, the heavy, commercial-grade hinge whooshing open and clicking shut. A familiar sound, registering perhaps 50 times a day, usually accompanying a confused citizen or a uniformed officer retrieving a forgotten jacket. Shaw didn't look up. He heard the muffled exchange at the front desk, the polite, yet firm voice of the duty officer, Officer Reyes. "Can I help you, ma'am? You can wait right over there if you need to speak to a detective." Then a new voice. A voice Shaw had never heard before, yet one that cut through the background noise with the clarity of a dropped pane of glass. It was a woman's voice, low and slightly rough, carrying an accent that wasn't local, something that suggested distance, perhaps the American Southwest, or maybe just a hard life. "I need to speak to the person in charge of the Sarah Jenkins case. I'm afraid it's a cold case, but I have information." The words hung in the stale air of the bullpen like ice crystals. Detective Shaw's hands froze, hovering over his keyboard. The VIN number blurred. The headache instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden, terrifying rush of adrenaline that tightened his chest. Officer Reyes's voice, now a nervous, high-pitched murmur. "Ma'am, that's 15 years old." "We don't," the woman interrupted, her voice gaining a sharp, unsettling authority. "I understand, but I think the detective might want to see me. My name is Sarah Jenkins." The silence that descended upon the Havenwood Detective Division was absolute, instantaneous, and profound. The police scanner continued its monotonous report of the lost cat, a bizarre counterpoint to the impossible reality unfolding 20 feet away. Detective Rodriguez's pen clattered onto her desk. Every eye in the bullpen was now fixed on the entrance. Shaw's chair scraped back as he stood up, moving without conscious thought. He walked past the shocked faces of his colleagues, his heart hammering against his ribs in a syncopated rhythm he hadn't felt since he was a rookie chasing his first armed robber. He saw her standing there, a young woman, perhaps 23, dressed in functional, dust-colored clothes that looked like she'd been traveling hard. She had the height and build of a young woman, but her posture held a brittle, defensive tension. Her hair was sun-bleached and slightly tangled, and her face. Shaw stopped dead at the entrance to the bullpen, his breath catching painfully. He scanned her face, looking past the years, the maturity, the hard-earned lines around her eyes. He searched for the echo of the familiar, and there it was. Not the gap-toothed smile, which was gone, but the shape of the jaw, the precise arch of the eyebrows, and the undeniable, unforgettable, slight asymmetry of the left ear that was clearly visible in the old-school photo. He looked into her eyes, which were a deep, startling blue. They were the eyes of the 8-year-old on the poster, but they held the haunted wisdom of a lifetime lived outside the bounds of civilized society. He took a single, slow step forward, the world tilting slightly on its axis. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice dry and foreign in his own throat. The young woman looked back at him, her haunted blue eyes locking onto his. She offered no smile, only a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes," she confirmed, her voice barely above a rasp. "And I know where I've been for the last 15 years. Find out if Detective Shaw can save Sarah from her pursuer and discover the truth of her 15-year absence in Part 2. This was Trace Crime Files. Subscribe for more stories where truth is stranger than fiction, and justice is never as simple as it seems.